Hello gamers, this video is going to give you some tips on how to predict blob movement in open field fights for newcomers to World v World. I am going to assume you have seen the prerequisite video on positioning linked in the description below, because this guide is going to expand into tip 11. This guide is going to cover a meta revolving around pirate shipping, and all footage is from the current May 10th patch. If in the future it becomes obsolete, I will make a new guide. In my view, paying attention to your commander's movement is insufficient, you must also be able to predict the enemy's movement. Why predict blob movement? Knowing how the enemy might move is useful for literally every role in World v World. Whether you are DPS, stab source, boon stripper, cleanse bot, knowing when the enemy pushes will allow you to place good meteors, when to use your cleanses, when to give stab, when to place your traps, where to place winds of disenchantment, where to cast your AoEs, etc. It also allows you to predict your commander's next possible movement before he or she even announces it in voice chat. Among other things, predicting blob movement will improve your reaction time. One does not need to predict the enemy movement minutes in advance, doing so consistently is impossible. Instead, one need only predict enemy movements a few seconds in advance. Even a 3-second prediction window is enough to land a good meteor, the one skill that takes the longest to cast. Predicting the movement of blobs is going to take some time and effort if you are completely new. Hopefully this guide can be of use as a starting point. How to spot uneven fights, the W key. This guide will assume that both sides are relatively even in numbers and experience. I will first start by explaining how to spot uneven fights, for which some of the points in this guide will be rendered moot. When fights are uneven, one group can just W key the other group. What I mean by this is that one group will literally take the shortest distance to the enemy group by holding the W key and tries to stay on top of the other group until one group wipes. This typically happens when one group vastly outnumbers the other, or one group lacks DPS pressure and or sustain in the form of scrappers. Between two evenly experienced groups, W keying practically does not happen because the one pushing is at a disadvantage because of the existence and effectiveness of dragon hunter traps, breaches, and winds of disenchantment, not to mention it makes it easy to place every single AoE in the game, for example, wells, meteors, gravity wells, etc. if one tag always beelines for the other tag. The W key also happens when one commander deems the fight to be practically over, that is, one side has lost too many players to pose any significant threat. From here on, I will assume both sides are equally competent unless otherwise stated. Note that there are exceptions to every trend I am going to mention because blobs are not homogeneous and each commander has his or her own personal preferences. These are merely my observations. Pre-fight maneuvers. Fake push. Fights start either with fake pushes or range spikes at 1200 range. During fake pushes, the enemy pretends to approach you and then makes up the 180 turn. The intention is to waste a few DPS cooldowns. The vast majority of fake pushes happens at greater than 1200 range, with close range fake pushes being more risky the more spread out the enemy Zerg is, often resulting in actual casualties from the blob initiating the close range fake push, which runs counter to the whole point of doing a fake push. The enemy commander usually informs the entire Zerg prior to the fake push, meaning the obvious indicator might sometimes be the enemy players at the back that remain stationary, especially if they do not have stability or do not trust their source of stability. The strongest indicator would be one player, that is the enemy commander, in the Zerg suddenly turning around. The next strongest indicator would be the absence of empower. Note that the presence of empower does not necessarily mean the enemy intends to commit because empower is on a very short cooldown. Veil can sometimes be used as a feint because a single veil can stealth the entire Zerg, whereas you need to burn the Scrapper's elite to stealth the entire group. Furthermore, the enemy Chronomancer can mimic the veil, or there might be more than one chrono, making veil more disposable for fake pushes. The closer the veil, the more likely it is not a feint. Veils at greater than 1200 range usually means a fake push because a veil at that range is very noticeable and the other tag can just back off safely to wait for the stealth to be over. Commanders will not expend the Scrapper's Elite for a fake push because the Scrapper's Elite only affects 5 allies unlike Veil, meaning every single Scrapper in the squad has to put the Scrapper's Elite on cooldown for a whole minute. You should not expend any DPS cooldowns for fake pushes, but if you are a firebrand, you should still give Little Stab with Mantra of Liberation and Aegis with Shield of Judgment. Scrappers should use Defense Field for the extra stability. As you can see here, it is still possible to be pulled with 1 stack of stability. CC can only remove 1 stack of stability every 0.75 seconds, while Corrupts and Boon Strips will remove all stacks, even 25 stacks of stability. However, the final stack removed does not provide this gracious immunity, meaning you can still be pulled after the 1 stack disappears. Here I am pulled with Mesmer Focus 4, a 2-part skill, with the first being 900 range and is where you will be pulled to, and the second being the actual pull, which has 600 range. If you have a Firebrand and Scrapper providing stab, you will for the most part be fine because most of the range boon rips comes from Scourges at 900 range, although Spinal Shivers, a single target skill, is 1200 range. Although Null Field is 1200 range, most competent Chronomancers do not waste it on 1200 range spikes, instead comboing it with Mimic and or Continuum Split. Ranged Spike. If it is not a fake push, it is a 1200 range spike where Revenants use Hammer 2 and 3, Guardians use Staff 2 and 3, Weavers use Fire Staff 2. During a ranged spike the blob stands still for a few seconds so that Revenants will not be alone after their phase smash ends, albeit certain tags will call for a ranged spike while on the move. The ranged spike is easily sidestepped, although most Zergs will try to trade the spike with Aegis and Firebrand Mace 3. Commanders may opt to do another ranged spike or another fake push at 1200 range, especially if both sides have not lost any significant number of players. If one side does too many fake pushes, the blob risks skills coming off cooldown anyway. The Pirateship. After the 1200 range fake pushes and ranged spikes comes the Pirateship. The Pirateship is very easy to anticipate. Like a pirate ship, both groups will strafe continuously to one side until eventually one side decides to go back to 1200 range around the damage for cooldowns, dodges and HP to come back up again, or one side changes direction, typically to push superficially. The pirate ship typically happens at 0 to 900 range and ends when one group runs out of space or if the tag gets low enough, since by virtue of being in front, the tag will receive most of the non-single target damage, regardless of any desire to pin snipe. This also means that pirate shipping occurs more often if both groups have high damage pressure, since the driver cannot physically push without going down. 900 range is when the enemy intends to commit a few cooldowns, typically wells. 900 range is also when most of the Scourge kit comes into play, with only the Scourge Axe 3 requiring 600 range. In practice, commanders might stray further from 900 range and wonder where the damage has gone to. Sometimes the groups that stack tighter can change direction during the strafe to get closer to the enemy Zerg while sidelining some damage. For groups that have trust issues, suddenly changing directions is risky because such groups are naturally more spread out and the commander risks cutting off his own Zerg. With the recent nerfs to range non-projectile damage, typically no one dies at 900 range if there is one Scrapper for each party and everyone is stacked properly because both sides are moving. Players on either side only go down only because of pulls or immobilize. Deep push. The deep push occurs when one group pushes into the other group to the extent that it overlaps certain portions of both blobs. This typically occurs when one group outnumbers the other. However, this is much rarer compared to pirate ships, because the one pushing in the current Dragon Hunter Scourge meta is always going to be at a disadvantage. The blob being pushed can simply drop their traps, breaches and winds of disenchantment for maximum effect, while the blob that is pushing will not have a good opportunity for their breaches and traps to do any good damage, and strips by the very nature of such skills being point-blank AoEs. When doing a deep push, most blobs at 1200 range will not take the shortest distance from your Zerg to theirs, that is, a straight line. Instead, one blob will usually pirate ship to get in closer and then commit to a deep push. This is because pushing from 1200 range means you have to walk over a plethora of enemy damage just to reach your target, not to mention it makes you predictable. And when your Zergs do overlap, the one that pushes will typically not continually push, that is, the aggressor will not continuously try to stay on top of the other Zerg. The reason for this is threefold. 1. The aggressor is extremely predictable, which makes placing literally every single AoE, e.g. wells, traps and breaches, meteors, bubbles, grave wells etc. extremely easy. That is, just place every skill you have at your feet and let the aggressor run over it. The second reason, most builds in the meta have short periods of high burst damage. After expending your high priority cooldowns, you are only left with auto attacks. The one being pushed will still have most of their cooldowns, leaving the aggressor very vulnerable to a counterpush or the stray traps. The third reason is more subtle and less impactful. Some players in the pushing blob will ultimately get their stability ripped and subsequently get CC'd by lines of warding, unsteady ground etc., or only the head will receive super speed or simply loading into a waypoint later. This will stretch the Zerg, which lowers the number of players that are actually on the tag, which makes it easier to hit the same target since most skills have a target cap of 5. Notice how spread out the enemy push is. Reactions to a deep push. There are 3 things that a Zerg can do to react to a deep push: counter push, kite, or stand still and die. There are some factors that influence whether a commander decides to counter push or to kite back. If the initial distance at which the aggressor pushes at is small and both groups are small, that is, less than or equal than 30, the one being pushed might opt to counterpush, in which case both Zergs just end up trading places. If the distance at which the aggressor initiates the push is at 900 range or more, most commanders will opt to kite instead. This way the kiter can maximize that 900 range gap and force the aggressor to walk through the AoE. This is especially true if the kiter is outnumbered. If the one being pushed already has stealth, that Zerg might opt to counter push since their approach will be hidden. In combat stealth. Most of you already know that stealth can be used out of combat to great effect because of the surprise element. Those caught might not even have any boons on them, making them easy kills. Stealth is not only used outside of combat to get quick kills at the start of fights or to one-push PPT groups. Experienced commanders will use stealth to close the gap to push. There are 2 common sources of stealth apart from objectives: that stealth, veils, and the scrapper's elite. Veils are more obvious to spot. Typically the veil will be placed 300 range in front of the commander or closer. Veil does not have a target cap. If you see the enemy Zerg suddenly disappearing past a certain line, that is a veil and you should call it out. Your commander will usually back off if he or she spots the veil. If the veil is used literally 300 range away from your commander, it is almost certainly a push from the enemy. If the veil is placed behind the enemy commander and away from you, they can still turn 180 degrees and counterpush with super speed if your blob overextends. The one that is harder to spot is the scrapper's elite, especially if it is not accompanied with any blast. Some commanders will explicitly tell you to not blast the stealth field because it notifies the enemy of an attempt to stealth fire an audio cue. In the case where the enemy does not have a scrapper for every party, the whole enemy blob will not be in stealth, in which case the players that you do see are usually the tail, creating this deceptive illusion that the main group is further away until it is too late. This is compounded by the use of superspeed in conjunction with the scrapper's elite. The whole Zerg need not be stealthed, only a portion, and you do not have to fool the entire enemy blob, only the ones that are slow to react to score some kills. One effective way that commanders use the sneak gyro for is to counter stealth, that is, upon seeing that the enemy has stealthed, they respond with stealth of their own. Some Zergs, however, are too slow to pull a counter stealth off fast enough and they end up getting caught in the enemy stealth bomb. Prior victories and losses influences the distance at which the pirateship occurs and how frequent pushes are. The more a Zerg loses, the more spread out the Zerg will be and the less the Zerg will push, especially a deep push. Even extremely experienced commanders with over 1 million kills are still susceptible. Without any prior history, the reputation of the driver and the KD of the server is usually a good proxy. Chokepoints. choke points are dangerous because they limit the degree of movement commanders can make, and one Zerg can stack all the AoEs on one narrow spot. This makes pushing a choke point extremely dangerous. Therefore, commanders will usually push through a choke with some form of stealth. Terrain. Rarely, a Zerg might find themselves on undesirable terrain, such as backed up against a wall, which greatly limits the possible movements they can make. Even worse, the commander might attempt to cross terrain which requires jumping. You might not be able to clearly see what you are jumping when everyone else is also spamming jump. This makes jumping to cross terrain almost like a free stunt since you cannot use most skills while jumping. This means you are free to do whatever against the jumping Zerg without any damage pressure. Here is an annotated fight to summarize most of the points made so far.
Go upper, go upper, go upper, go upper, go upper. Go right now. Okay guys, I will need flange for this. So stay on me. Okay guys. 1, 2, 3. Speed sur moi, speed sur moi, speed sur moi, speed sur moi. Giro dans 1, 2, 3, giro, 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 passe à droite, prends le veil, prends le veil, prends le veil, prends le veil maintenant, tu reverses maintenant, dans le veil, passe à gauche, passe à gauche, passe à gauche, passe à gauche, tu vas bomber les rouges dans le cul dans 1, 2, 3, ok, bomb the red, just little bomb, just little bomb. Ok, go back dans 1, 3, back maintenant, kill this guy, go right now, and big walls on the blue tree, big walls on the blue, go right, bitch on me, nice fucking job, go, pushing, prepare to reverse on the red tree, reverse on the red tree, let's go. Push the red, spike the red, let's go, spike in front, let's fucking go guys. Okay, I was saying I did in French but I lose my words in English. Ok, ce spike devant, passe à droite, maintenant, passe devant, pusher, et stop maintenant, back, ils ont brèche, je passe à gauche dans 1, 2, 3, passe à gauche maintenant, déplace devant, faites les restes, il maintenant sur moi, déplace devant, continue, push encore, passe à gauche maintenant, oh, let's go. Fuck you well sur eux. Ok, passe à droite, fais les dons. Ok, back au pont, au pont. Laissez à gauche dans 1, 2, 3, viens à droite, attends, spike devant, spike devant, passe à gauche dans 1, passe à gauche, cross à gauche, et damage, go mêlée, passe à gauche, viens prends le bait dans 1, 3, prends le temps, passe à gauche, tu spike encore, ok, il y a les bleus qui arrivent, mettez du pool, ok, tu back maintenant, arrive, back, ok, back encore, full back, ok, viens sur ma giro dans 1, 2, 3, giro, passe à gauche dans 1, 3, go à gauche maintenant, ok, full wall sur wall devant, continue, là top down, passe à droite maintenant, tu mets les chais devant, tu les as, continue de mèche, let's go, ok, guys, go back maintenant. Go back, Snake. Bitch on me. Ok, go left maintenant. Nice bubble. Go in the bubble. Go right, faites le reste de ce courgette. Ok, back maintenant. Ok, we need to have the gyro. I don't see the blue coming.